Hello, everybody. I am Julie Stewart. I am one of the NDEC Planning Committee members, and we are thrilled to have you here with all of us today for day 2. Before we go ahead, I do want to give you a little instruction on how to use Zoom effectively. In terms of accessibility for your viewing enjoyment, we're in webinar mode, and it's best viewed on either a desktop or laptop rather than on a mobile device. We have fabulous interpreters working into English today, so turn up your volume if you'd like to access the English interpretation. There are also captions available. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is a closed caption icon and you can select that to see the English text. Should you have any struggles with the audio or the captions, please get a hold of our tech team. You can do that via selecting the chat down the bottom of your screen as the option. Now, in using Zoom, you have some preferences on what the screen looks like. There is a fine line that's white in between the panel view and the PowerPoint view. So you can use your cursor to make those windows as large as you would like and suit your preferences. You might want to view this in full screen today. During the video presentation, you may absolutely have questions that you'd like to ask of our keynote presenter. You can do that by putting those questions into the QA icon. Should you have issues with technical support, those go into the chat box. At this point, I'd like to thank our sponsors, without whose generous support this would not be possible. So CSD Learns has been wonderfully supportive, especially with their behind the scenes work. NAD has been an original sponsor since this idea first came about and is also great support to the deaf community. There's also Dawn Sign Press, the American School for the Deaf, the Indiana School for the Deaf, and Gallaudet University. So we're very appreciative of their sponsorship for this event also. At this point, I would like to introduce Brian. I believe he's ready. Brian Milburn is the program manager for CSD Learns. Brian, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I am thrilled to be here today. My name is Brian Milburn. I am part of the CSD Learns team, helping to support make this event possible. Maybe you've seen our ads so far in NDEC or our toolkits that have been promotionalized here. So we'd like to show you a little bit about what we do at CSD Learns. We create toolkits that focus on STEM education. You can see a little bit about what they look like here. We have different programs on cybersecurity, for example, programming, immunology. We also make tools for personal finance. This helps young adults understand debt, budgeting, and you can see a link at the bottom of our slide here to view more about these toolkits. We also spotlight role models through our toolkits. We've created videos that we integrate into our educational content and activities of deaf role models for students. We started 1.5 years ago with these 4. And I'd like to show you a brief clip of what these types of spotlights look like. This is an example of one introduction that we have in our curriculum. So this is obviously a video related to computer science. In this video, Amanda is introducing some information about cybersecurity for middle schoolers. So this is very much an introduction to IT for an age-appropriate group. And in the video, we say, hello, my name is Amanda Wyrick. I am deaf and I specialize in STEM. There are real-world problems today, such as technology not working. My job is to make sure that all different types of technology work together smoothly for you. I will share my story. Back to Brian. The next clip I'll play now. This person's name is Joe. Joe's saying, what is my career path? I want to continue advancing my education and hope to get my PhD. I want to do research that involves ASL and artificial intelligence. What does that mean? It means when we sign, it will be possible to have that translated into a different language. Isn't that cool? So we really like to include our role models in the curriculum. And here's another example. This one is about emphasizing STEM skills and teamwork. And the presenter is saying, when a community comes to an agreement. For example, if you as one person go to the park and pick up some trash, you can spend 10 hours doing something. But if you did that as a group, if as a community you went and did a litter pickup, you could get it done in just an hour. So a bigger group can have a bigger impact on your community. Ryan, we like to involve current events in our curricula so that our students feel like the information is relevant. We've now grown to over 15 role models with different communication skills and backgrounds, different identities that represent the diversity of our community. We've also started creating cartoons of our role models. One of our role models here is one student whose parents said that as a deaf person, they couldn't go to outer space. But they tell their story, and we've included them in one of our toolkits about space. And this person is actually working for NASA. We offer webinars on best practices. Obviously for this school year, e-learning is a very hot topic. And so we've offered some resources to students and to educators on how to employ e-learning tools. We are looking for more folks to join our team. If you're interested in curriculum work, if you have an expertise in STEM, if you're skilled in video editing or using Zoom, please consider joining our team. Email us through our website and find out more. Here are some pictures of our team, some of the events that we've done in the past, some of the work that we do. We have gone to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and you see us in front of a congressional office there. So we do send a delegation out into the world, and we feel like we've accomplished quite a lot in the last year and a half. Obviously, our workflow has changed quite a lot in the last few months. We are now doing remote video creation and editing, and I think that that's really relevant to our audience. We are really wanting to expand the representation that we show in our role models. 41% of our role models are BIPOC, Black and Indigenous people of color. And we'd also like to add more STEM offerings, online events, and whatnot for our community. We do focus groups because we need to know what it is that you need to know. And this year, with the impacts that COVID has had on education, we want to make sure that we're providing relevant resources to the community. Behind the scenes, we do have our team, the 4 of us that are pictured here on the slide. They are wonderful people, and we're so thrilled as a team to be supporting the National Deaf Education Conference. We've gotten this far because of RIT, General Motors, and Wells Fargo, who have generously supported our work. So thanks to them. That's it from me. Thank you for your eyes and ears this morning, today. Please enjoy the webinar, and we wish you all the best for the future in the next school year. Thanks and take care.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, for that explanation about what CSD is up to. It's very exciting to learn about those developments. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce today's first keynote speaker, Blake Culley. At the end of the keynote, there will be time for question and answer, but at this point, I'd like to introduce Blake to you all. Blake was born deaf to a hearing family in Ventura County, California. They graduated from California School for the Deaf Riverside back in 2006, and then took off to Gallaudet University to pursue a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a specialist degree in school psychology. Blake now works at the Kendall Demonstration Elementary School in Washington, D.C. as a school psychologist. Blake struggled with their gender identity for a really long time, since high school, without having the language to explain the experience that they were having. Finally, at the age of 28, Blake found the word non-binary and felt it really resonate with their experience. So the presentation you are about to see is a colourful array of topics that are specifically impactful for deaf LGBTQ+ youth in schools and how we as professionals can best support them. The content will address issues around gender identity, sexual orientation, and some statistics on LGBTQ+ youth in the education system. The emphasis will be on trans youth. Blake will also discuss best practices for professionals providing support to trans youth in order to see them thrive academically. I'm personally very excited to see Blake's presentation.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Well, I suppose right now it's 3 o'clock as I'm creating this video, but when you're going to be watching it, it'll be the morning. So good morning. My name is Blake Culley. I am a school psychologist at the Clare Center in Washington, D.C. I work specifically at the Kendall Demonstration Elementary School, KDES. To be honest with you, I am honored that the conference has asked me to present in one of the plenaries. I'll let you know that I'm nervous. I was nervous at the prospect of going to Chicago, standing on a stage in front of a large audience, and thinking the worst, of course. Now that we've gone virtual because of COVID, we're online. And I would love to say that that has made me even less nervous, more comfortable with the forum. But I can't say that because now we're not interacting with each other. And interactivity has always been an important part of what I'm doing. And you don't know what I'm wearing, right? I could be in my boxers, and that's a strange new reality for us. Anyway, today I'd like to talk about best practices for working with trans deaf students. We're looking at the intersection of those two identities today in this presentation, so I hope you enjoy it. Before I begin my presentation, I do want to recognize that this situation may be unique because you're likely sitting at home by yourself without folks around you. And you might not know exactly what to think about this topic before we get into it. I want to recognize that it's sensitive. I want to recognize that there are thoughts against it, thoughts that people don't believe in it, or that you may feel like it's a hoax. I want to recognize that people may feel uncomfortable listening to my presentation about gender identity, especially in children. What's important, and what I ask of you today, is that we respect each other. We may disagree, but I want us to accept the idea that we disagree and for us to listen to each other in this time. I ask you to keep an open mind as we go through this and for you to ask questions instead of assume that you know the answer. We hear that a lot, right? That people give assumptions or they make statements that they may not know to be true, but we want to engage in a dialogue after this presentation. Let's start out with some etiquette, words that we can use that sometimes harm. and the ways in which we can avoid those harmful words. The first term that I'll mention is a dead name. So at a person's birth, they're usually given a name that we may call a given name or a birth name. That is given to them by their parents most often. In the trans community, we call that name a dead name because it does not match their identity. And this person may choose their own name after some time. So Blake is my chosen name. It's a name that I chose for myself, and it is my name. My dead name is no longer in use. And it is not polite in our community to ask somebody's dead name. You may be curious as to what someone's name was before they transitioned, but that can be a triggering question for trans people. It can be a name that does not fit their identity. It can be a feminine name, for example, that does not fit my identity now. So please don't ask what somebody's dead name is. It's also very important not to ask what somebody's genitals are. That can also be a trigger, obviously. Some folks cannot afford surgery. Some folks feel okay with certain genitals, and that's really a very private question. The same is true about questioning someone's surgical history, if they've had surgery in certain ways. And if somebody can't afford surgery but they want it, that can be a demeaning question to them. So again, please don't ask about surgical history. It's also not polite to out others in the community, to talk about somebody's gender identity if they haven't been public with that. That's a very private thing. So if you were to say, oh, you know, Blake is a trans person and they're out, and start talking about that, that is not really a polite thing to do in the community. Instead, you should say, you know, Blake is a non-binary deaf person, and because I am out with that in the community, that's appropriate to talk about. But if somebody is not out, or if you don't know if they are out, then it's not appropriate to talk about that. Next, it's obviously polite to respect somebody's identity and the identities that they use for themselves, whether that's feminine or masculine or non-binary, and to not make assumptions about what identities that person has for themselves. So if you feel like that person looks feminine and they look too feminine to be non-binary, or they look too feminine to identify as male, it's not appropriate for you to make comments about that, because that person's identity is something that needs to be accepted in the community. And in the same vein, backhanded compliments can be easy to make, and it's important that we are aware of them. Saying something like, oh, you know, since you transitioned, you look so much more handsome, or you look better, can be demeaning to somebody who then would think that you thought they didn't look handsome before, or they didn't look very good. That can really affect somebody's self-esteem. Instead, you can offer compliments like, you look happy, you look great. Those are ways to compliment somebody without comparing them to a prior state. If you say, oh, you were pretty as a woman, but you look better as a man, that's not really a compliment to members of our community. I'd like to take a minute to define the acronym LGBTQIA. L stands for lesbian, and the sign is not made like this, but it's like this with the tip of the forefinger on the chin. G is for gay. You might fingerspell gay if you use the sign. That can be offensive to some members of the community. B stands for bisexual. You can fingerspell bi or bisexual. Both are appropriate. T stands for transgender, and this is the sign. The sign is like this, and I'll model it sideways for you as well. Not like this. If you see the sign opening up like that, please don't use it. Please stop somebody from using it. there are a group of trans deaf people who use the sign that I first modeled. They got together at a world gathering at one point and discussed signs that they felt were appropriate to describe trans people. Most of the time you would have seen TG, the finger spelling for transgender, before. Transsexual is now an outdated term that is no longer used. Transgender is the preferred term because we are changing our gender identity, not our sex, not our sexuality. So transsexual is now a word that is no longer in use. But those people got together and they came up with a sign that they felt would best represent their identities as trans people. And one person said that this sign for trans looks like the sign for beautiful, and that is a positive way of cherishing the identities that we have as trans people. Q can stand for queer or questioning. Queer is a word that had been used to demean queer people, and so queer people have reclaimed that word and used it again, and it's very much in popular use now. Q can also mean questioning, meaning somebody who is not sure of their identity, either sexually or gender-wise. I means intersex, and here's a sign for that, modeled both forward and on the side. This is used by people who are intersex. This means that they have, oftentimes they have hormones that might be determined by their DNA. So they may have 2 X's and a Y chromosome, or just an X chromosome, or there are actually 6 different karyotypes that are possible, 6 different gene combinations that can cause somebody to be intersex. So that's what the I means in our acronym. A means asexual. This is a person who is really not interested in sex. A person who might not have sexual needs that are typical, or they might be interested in sex, but it's not something that's at the forefront of their identity. A does not mean ally. Allies are not part of our community. We certainly appreciate allies in the world, people who support the LGBTQIA community. Those are heterosexual, cisgendered people. But the A in our acronym does not stand for ally. They are not part of our community. I want to define sex for a moment. Sex is something that is based on your DNA. It is something that when you are born, you have a certain genetic makeup, and that comes from the chromosomes in your body. On a driver's license, you typically see sex, and you'll see the letter F, M, or sometimes X. Now, many states are adopting the letter X for people who so choose. So typically we say if you're born with a vagina, you are a female sex. If you're born with a penis, you are a boy, you are a male sex. Intersex people, as we mentioned in the prior slide, may be born with both sets of genitals, or sometimes a doctor might not be sure, so they'll run a DNA test to find out what sex that person is. It's important that we don't confuse sex with sexual attraction or gender identity.
Now, we just talked about the definition of sex. That is based on the DNA that you're born with, the biology of your body. Now let's talk about gender, boys, girls, men, and women. Or non-binary. There are different genders. Gender is a social construct. It's built around what gender should be. The idea is that if you are born with a penis, you should be a man. But that's not true. If you don't feel like a man, or you don't feel like you follow what society's expectations of a man should be. The opposite is true if you're born with a vagina and society says you should act like a woman. That is a gender stereotype that's been given to you. Society says that our expectations of women are these, and you might not feel like you fit that. Gender identity can be trans, cis or cisgender, and that's signed like this. And the word cisgender means that the sex that you have been assigned at birth matches your gender identity. The prefix for cis in Latin means the same, whereas the prefix trans in Latin means to change. So that's where we get the idea of transgender, somebody who feels that their gender identity does not match their sex. The feeling of not matching may seem like a negative thing, but we need to push back at that. We should allow space for people to say that their gender identity does not match their sex.
And somebody who is non-binary means that they don't feel like they fit in either gender box. They might grow up and realize that they would like to come out of the woman box, but they don't want to go into the male box. And most of the time, many times, students or young children don't have the language access to know about this other box, this non-binary box. And this was certainly true for me. When social media came about, I started following people who were trans, and I realized that this was a box for me, or that I didn't need to sit in either of those two boxes, and that non-binary would be okay as a place for me to be as an identity. So I mentioned this before. I think that language is very important when it comes to talking about gender identity. We don't necessarily have the language in ASL to talk about a lot of these things that we see written about in English. And so we do use a lot of finger spelling, especially when it comes to different identities. A name can definitely be part of somebody's identity. And that's why we see names being so important. And I think as a community, we need to start coming up with signs that will help us describe some of these identities so that we have so that children have better access to that through language. Pronouns are also a very important language tool that we can use to signal our identity. And they, them pronouns in particular are something that many people can struggle with. They, them, I hear often people say, well, they, them is supposed to be for many people in the plural. But in English, we already have the pronoun you that is used in both the singular and the plural. You can say you for one person or you for many people. So using they for the singular and for the plural is something that we already can start to get used to. It's important that you respect somebody's pronouns. Oftentimes now, people will give their pronouns. You may have seen this in people's email signatures. I include this in all of my email signatures. You'll see at the bottom of my email, Blake Culley, Sci S, NCSP. I'm a school psychologist. I work at the Clare Center. And then below that, I list my pronouns, they, them, their. So people can see that in my email signature and know that they should use they pronouns for me. But we need to engage in that type of discussion. In ASL, we need to come up with signs for some of these concepts that we don't have yet. There are many complex terms that we still need to grapple with and fully understand so that we understand the different identities, the very complex gender identities in the community. Here's a list of some pronouns, the most common. you know of she, he, they. There's also Z, spelled Z-E or X-E. There's Zir. There's quite a few, but I'm listing 4 here, and the ways in which you can use those pronouns. In the last column, you'll see some example sentences of how you might write those pronouns in common speech. So if we look at they and them, as I mentioned before, some people really struggle with using that because they're used to seeing they and them in English being for the plural. In ASL, I would say they and just point to one person. Or if I meant they in the plural, I would point in a sort of circular motion. So that's clear in ASL as to whether I mean one or multiple people. I do want to provide you an example in English of how we would use they in the singular historically that might help to show how we would use it today. If a lot of people were in a meeting room and everyone left and there was one water bottle left over, you would say, someone must have left their water bottle. Someone, so you know we're only talking about one person, but then you use the possessive their because you don't know the person's gender. So it's clear in English that we have a history of using they in the singular. I'd like to talk about transitioning now. Transitioning takes many forms, and we'll see in the next few slides the specific types of transitions that can happen. The first type of transition is a cultural or social transition. This can be as simple as changing somebody's name. That is considered a type of transition. If somebody feels like there's a different name that best suits their identity, then they may change that. They may ask to change their gender marker in the world. And so that's one type of social change. Legal changes are another type of change. So that would generally include going to court, having some legal documents drawn up to testify before a judge and ask for a change of gender marker on legal documents. There are different states that have different policies for this. Some make it quite easy, some make it quite difficult. I remember going in December, and they gave me a court date for February 22nd, which felt like forever away. It was 2 months. It costs money. In some states, other states they don't charge for that type of procedure. And there are different procedures based on whether you're doing something at the state level or at the federal level. And some systems, for example, Social Security, may allow you to request a waiver of the fees. So the legal changes generally will look like changing your sex marker on your driver's license. And as I mentioned before, some states will allow you to put an X if you're non-binary. I have an X on mine. I don't identify with M or F. I always teased that when I had an F and people asked me about that, since I don't identify as female, F meant fake. But now on my driver's license, there is an X, which, as I mentioned, is a legal change and one type of transition. Birth certificates are generally very difficult to change. I have not done that. I would have to go to California, and since I live in Washington, D.C., that would be a difficult process. Passports may also have changes applied to them if you ask for that. Banks may ask you to provide legal documentation if you'd like to change the name on your account. So there are a lot of very complex types of legal transitions that you can make. Medical changes may include hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. So people who would like to change their appearance from feminine to masculine, for example, may take testosterone. So for myself, I had a natural high level of estrogen and low level of testosterone, and I wanted to reverse that. So I take testosterone. Most of the time, it's in the form of a shot. Sometimes it's in a pen that is injected into the skin. But what's important is that that is released slowly over time. The device that's inserted into the skin is usually lasts 3 to 6 months. There's also patches, there's a gel. There are different ways in which you can administer these types of hormones. Again, as I mentioned, it's important that they be small doses that are administered over time. There are 2 different types of shots, IM, intramuscular, and subcutaneous shots. The intramuscular means that it needs to go into a muscle. Subcutaneous, which is the type that I use, needs to be injected into fat. So I can inject that into my stomach, my leg, my thigh, or my buttocks. Those who identify with the female gender, want to look more feminine, will take estrogen instead of testosterone, or they'll take a testosterone blocker. Testosterone is a more aggressive hormone, and that tends to go to higher levels. So those people may need to take an estrogen booster and a testosterone blocker to get to the place where they would like to be. So the blocker would stop testosterone from being produced naturally by the body, and then they would take estrogen to try to appear more feminine. Surgery is another type of medical change. I've undergone a double mastectomy surgery where you remove the breasts. The type of surgery that I had is a DI double incision. So I do have scars on my chest. There are other types of surgeries that do not involve scars, where they will go through the nipple to remove the breast tissue to reduce the size of the chest. So you won't see a scar on those people. But the most common is the DI type of surgery, the double incision type of mastectomy. There are other types of surgery on the genitals, and I won't talk about those here. You can Google bottom surgery yourself. I did not have that type of surgery. I was satisfied with my genitals, and I felt like my body was okay as it was. Trans people, men to women, will have breast augmentation surgery, which is sort of the opposite concept, and they may have bottom surgery to change their penis into a vagina. So again, if you're interested in learning more about those types of surgery, you can Google that. These types of surgeries are expensive, obviously. Some people can't afford them. I was able to take out a loan for my surgery and pay the rest myself. Sometimes insurance will cover it, sometimes it won't.
Now, all that said, transition is an incredibly personal process. It takes a lot of emotional strength. When I started hormone replacement therapy, HRT, goodness, my moods were all over the place. I was cranky, I was upset, I could get irritable over the smallest things. And people can be concerned about that. If you're taking shots of some sort, and it can make people angrier or more likely to sort of explode in anger. So there are some things that we really need to talk about. But if you already have an anger management program, or an anger management issue rather, this might be more difficult for you. But it also might be fairly easy for people to deal with if that's not really their nature. but everyone will be just fine. They'll go through this process. You might be a little irritable at the beginning, like I was, as your hormones readjust to a new setting and get more stable. So questions like, have you finished your HRT? Have you started it? Have you had therapy? Have you had the surgery yet? All can get a little overwhelming and stressful and honestly exhausting to manage on an emotional level. Doctors probably don't cover it. Insurance usually doesn't cover it. And state to state, things are very different. Some states are very strict and require that a person goes to see a therapist to ensure that they have gender dysphoria as a diagnosis. And not every person who is trans has gender dysphoria. So that's not a requirement for being trans, but it is a requirement for some states to cover it with insurance. There are also some doctors who feel they need to confirm visually by looking at the person that they absolutely do have gender dysphoria and can have it as a diagnosis and then send that person on to therapy. But that's not always necessary. It involves money, so there's a lot of expenditures in this. And cisgendered people, which I will get to momentarily, cisgendered people are not outlaying funds for all of these kinds of things. It's a very different, much more expensive process for people who are transitioning. And I can't reiterate this strongly enough. It seriously is a very personal process for one's sense of identity and to change any or all parts of that identity as a person transitions in the trans world. So don't ask people why they did or didn't do what they have done. They're transitioning the way they want to and they choose to in this very personal process. And don't demean their identity. Don't talk about what it is, what they look like. Let the person have their personal experience. And now let's bring it to kids. A lot of younger kids have identified themselves as trans. And it can be an incredibly emotional experience for them, not understanding why their appearance is changing, why they're getting grumpy and looking around for support and not feeling as though they have it. You may see it manifest as behavioral issues, for example, and they just want to be accepted for who they are. In high school, a lot of students who are trans youth will go through hormone replacement therapy that may make them riddled with hormonal fluctuation, but it's no different than puberty. So if you see a student who's upset, they're going through hormonal changes. And again, like I said, transition is a very personal process. So let the student share what they want to share. Don't be too invested in asking a whole lot of questions from nosiness. Let them share. And as a trans deaf person, let them come to someone like me who has got the answers and the knowledge for things that they might be asking. And our best friend is Google. If you have more in-depth questions, feel free to go Google some of them rather than bombarding the trans person. Now let's turn now to some of the issues that LGBTQI youth face. I'm doing that via a couple of infographics here. Schools in general are not safe for gender expansive students. They are often called things like fag or dyke, and other homophobic remarks are often addressed to LGBTQ youth. And 30% have missed at least one day of school based on being bullied in this way. 85% say they have been verbally harassed in the past year. Now, this is the results of a 2013 survey, and there's not a more recent version yet. And it's in public schools. But is it happening in deaf schools? I absolutely believe it is. There's no scientific evidence yet. We haven't got the research to back it up, but anecdotally, we certainly believe it's happening. So if it's in public schools, it's certainly in deaf schools. And we believe it's at equally high in incidence. So I got bombarded with homophobic comments in high school. I didn't know what I was yet. I hadn't discovered an identity for myself, but people called me dyke all the time. Now, in the second infographic, it talks about hostile school climates, and that can be a very negative effect on our LGBT students, on their success and their overall sense of well-being. What I mean by that is that their GPA may lower, it may plummet, They may be less likely to plan to go to college and continue their education, and their self-esteem may really suffer. So of course, there are some emotional needs in that counselling may assist with, but the student may be embarrassed or they may not be ready to out themselves yet. So these issues can absolutely come up for students in the community. And then if we add deafness to that, we see the same kinds of things happening. Deaf trans students are also bullied. And often by not understanding the meaning of some of the words. Some of these slurs are cast around without people quite knowing what they mean. Now, this next infographic talks about students in elementary school who have already identified themselves as LGBTQA, and the fact that at that very young age, they're already experiencing bullying. They're more likely to be called names, to be bullied, and it's 56% of students who are identified as trans, as compared to 33% of other students who experience bullying. And 41% of teachers don't feel comfortable addressing questions about transgender identity. So when they're asked questions about it in the community, 41% of teachers admitted that they have some level of anxiety about responding to those types of questions. And so those LGBTQ students in the school environment feel very unsafe. 42% of students who are not identified as LGBTQ feel unsafe in school, compared to 61% who are LGBTQ youth feeling unsafe. So that 61% is a very high number of students who don't feel safe in school. Now let's look at transgender youth nationwide. 73.7% of transgender youth say that they have been sexually harassed during the past school year. And again, this is taken from data derived in 2013. But in that, only 1/3 of teachers engaged in any efforts to create a safer environment for those students. 33%. That's not a high percentage of teachers addressing this. 1/3 of transgendered youth have attempted suicide, and possibly because of continued bullying and name calling, sexual harassment, and myriad other negative factors that they're trying to deal with. They may be out to their families but not accepted by their families. They may not be out in school, or they may not be accepted in school. So 1/3 have attempted suicide, and 45% have seriously thought about killing themselves. They haven't attempted suicide, but they've thought about it. And that is almost half. That is way too high a number. We absolutely need to work to reduce that number. That's crucial. It's a very big concern in the transgender youth community. Some further statistics. When we look at urban environments, we see that 59 to 67% of transgender youth have engaged in sex work. And I say sex work specifically and spotlight that because sometimes other work environments are not safe. Transgendered youth may not be hired in regular retail employment or in schools. So if they're not being hired there, they're turning to sex work to earn an income. 20% of those students or youth are HIV positive at such a young age. And 40 to 50% say they engage in the use of alcohol or drugs when engaging in sex. 40% of all homeless youth are transgender or gay. Now, of that 40% of homeless youth who are transgender or gay, 62% are Black and 22% are Hispanic. And 1 in 5 transgender youth is at risk of or is homeless. So the important points about this are that we sometimes don't realize that homeless shelters are based on the sex assigned at birth, not based on a gender identity of a trans person. And I keep emphasizing these infographics and statistics for a couple of reasons. It shows that there is very little support in schools and that schools are not safe spaces for our trans youth. Quite often they're not accepted by their parents and they may be kicked out of home and become homeless, have no idea what to do. And as we can see, they're turning to sex and drugs and alcohol to make it through, and they're not necessarily safe activities either. So many Black trans youth are being killed, and that's an unfortunate reality right now. So I really want to impress upon you all that the need for support, especially in the school environment, and maintaining that as a safe space is critical. So now you have some sense of the difference between sex and gender identity, how they're different, but you still might not really know how to support LGBTQ students in your environment. Let's talk about inclusive action planning. This goes to support students of any type. So students who may not be comfortable, may not know why they're not comfortable. So it's important that we give some explanation so that students have a better understanding of gender identity, and give support to our deaf LGBTQ students with a variety of options that I've outlined here that you can use as a starting place. Look at inclusive action planning. Do you have inclusive action planning? If not, you might want to start. Start with some research on your policies. Go through them all. Go through your lesson plans. See if they are gender inclusive. If not, take some training or give training to those who need it. Really, the goal is support for all students. Absolutely is support for all students. But students are becoming more aware about gender identity and the difference between gender identity and sex assigned at birth. So if that's truth, do you have gender inclusive policies ready for your schools? Do you have students who can join GSA teams, like the Gay Straight Alliance? What do your laws look at? Trans students in many states are allowed to join the team of their gender identity rather than the sex assigned at birth. So you want to look at the policies you have to ensure that you're protecting that right. Do you have other leagues for sports? Look at the policies and procedures around them to make sure that they're gender inclusive and protective of trans students. Be part of what gives them a voice. They're going to need support, but they won't always know how. Students don't even necessarily know how. So help them take steps in the right direction by providing a supportive environment as you pay attention to those students. We are obviously always looking to support our students and respond to their questions, but we need to have an open space for that dialogue and a space that students can come to for support. Again, they may not have the support in their home environment, so coming to school may be the only place where they can feel safe, and that's the environment we want to foster in the academic environment. So thoughts for you are considering how far along your school is in that plan. And then look at your lesson plans. Do you have activities where you separate from boys and girls? That may make students feel uncomfortable. Let's look at some different arrangements. Maybe base it on articles of clothing and their color and say anyone wearing yellow, blue or red shirts is team A and anyone wearing green, purple or black shirts is team B. That's a way to divide students for activities that does not use gender. Then look at your messaging. When you send an email, do you say girls? Or do you say something a little more inclusive like, hi everyone, switching to more inclusive language? Hi everyone, hello students, that kind of thing. But not boys and girls, because again, that sits on the binary fallacy. If you know your students really well, they are going to want a little time and attention. You're going to notice that they need support. And if you don't know how to give it appropriately, find someone who does know how to give the appropriate support. And if you are forthright with your students and you say to them that you don't have the understanding, because they may understand way more than we recognize. Say, can I put you in touch with someone who I think is better equipped for this? Ask them. Most of the time, the students are going to understand that you don't have all of the knowledge and will appreciate that you're at least giving them some kind of support in that way. So this is not the finite list of things to do. Obviously, there are many more approaches you can take, but this is just a starting place for you. Now let's look at this positive support for students. Now, obviously, our goal is to give all students positive reinforcement. We want all of our students to excel, not just those who are in the LGBTQIA community, but that support might be increased for those students. We want them to be healthy and happy. We want to see them glow. We want to see their motivation and enthusiasm continue, their confidence and self-esteem to thrive. We want to see their community engagement, their sense of safety, well-being. All of this comes from the positive support that teachers can provide. That well-being increases when they're going to school. Remember I said the high percentage of students who don't feel safe at school? Because there's no support is typically the reason. So if you know how to give support, the students' interest in coming back to school and that safe and supportive environment is going to increase. They may not be getting it from home. Their parents may not be supportive at all, but at least that student can say, when I go to school, it's all right. My teachers support me. I've got my friends and my peer group around me, and that is one place I can go. And all of this can lead to life satisfaction, which is obviously really important. So these are incredibly positive outcomes of providing a supportive environment for our students. Now, if a student's not yet out to their parents or family, or perhaps they are out to their parents and family, but unfortunately are not being accepted for their gender identity, what can we do on behalf of that student? Ask the student. That student honestly knows more than we do about what would be helpful to them. So ask them, what can I do to help you or support you? What resources can I help you find? What can I do to assist? What do you want me to do? All of those questions are best geared to the student, who can then help decide the best accommodations. Like, let's talk about bathrooms, for example. Are your bathrooms gender divided or non-gender for bathrooms? This is a really important question in your schools. That's just one example to talk about. There's a couple of others. If a student packs some clothes in their backpack that are different from what their sex assigned at birth looks like, let them wear those clothes at school. Maybe they're not allowed to wear them at home. Give them the space to do it at school. Respect their preferences. It may not make sense to you, but respect the student because they're doing what makes sense to them. And if the peers are getting a bit excessively curious, you can help redirect that by changing the topic, or even better, you can educate the entire class about gender identity and gender expression. Have discussions about that are authentic and healthy in the classroom. Then it doesn't leave the student feeling burdened by having to respond to all of this. Have an open discussion where the whole class learns together. Consider asking your school about the services that they provide. What kind of organisations are at your school? Research shows that students feel more comfortable going to school when they already have something like a gay-straight alliance, or when there's already an LGBTQ organisation at the school that they can elect to join. Research shows students feel better with that. Schools that don't have any of those organisations available lessen trans students' interest in coming to school. So what we do matters, and we need to continue providing these kinds of support. Again, if you don't know how, refer to someone who does. And be 100% authentic and frank with your students. Parental support is also an issue that needs ongoing discussion. In the school environment, we need to continue being part of the solution. Now let's talk about the Clare Centre's bathroom policy. We decided that all of our bathrooms would be gender neutral at our school. So we're lucky, we're a fairly small school. We're only serving about 97 students in K through 8th grade at the Clare Centre. But it is an awesome idea, and I hope your schools can follow suit. So we had originally boys and girls bathrooms, and we changed all of them to simply being blue and yellow. So they're not boys and girls, they're simply blue bathrooms and yellow bathrooms. And each department, K through 2nd grade, 3rd through 5th grade, and 6th through 8th grade, has their own bathrooms available for use. So if you see the picture at the end, and you see there at the bathroom, there is a blue and a yellow tag. All students in each department take one of those tags to go to the bathroom. So it looks like this. Maybe a first grader needs to go to the bathroom. They are permitted, they head to the hallway and they see a blue tag and a yellow tag. They take whichever one they want, it doesn't matter. So let's suppose they take the yellow tag. They go to the yellow bathroom. And when they come back, they replace that yellow tag. If, however, while they're in the yellow bathroom, a second grader wants the bathroom, they come along and see the blue tag is gone, the yellow tag rather is gone, and the yellow bathroom is therefore occupied. So they take the blue tag, and then the blue bathroom's occupied. So suppose a third student at this stage in kindergarten decide that they need to go to the bathroom. They come out, they see that both the yellow and the blue tags are gone, which means that both the yellow and the blue bathrooms are occupied. So they wait a few moments until one of those people exits the bathroom, returns the tag, and continue on. That's our bathroom system. And we wanted to work that out to make sure that it worked seamlessly, and it has done. Part of that process was sending a letter to parents to let them know that we would be changing our bathrooms to gender neutral and that all the bathrooms would be gender neutral. We sent that letter out, got no complaints in response, just support, established our system, and everyone is very cooperative. No students now feel distressed about going to a bathroom. Everyone uses the bathrooms as they need. Now, the urinals are going to be coming off. We'd like to take all of them off. We haven't currently done so. And in the long term, what we'd really like to do is make all of the bathroom stalls floor to ceiling enclosed cubicles. At this stage, however, money's a bit of an issue, so that's not happening yet. But the point is we want students to come to school feeling okay about things like bathrooms. So consider your bathrooms at your school institution and see if you can change them to being gender neutral. And it's going to make a big difference to your LGBTQ student population. So now at Gallaudet University, under whose umbrella the Clare Centre is established, they have an anti-discrimination policy, which we therefore follow. So with that anti-discrimination policy, it has several sections. You can look yourself, feel free to pull it up. But what we'll notice is that there are gender statements around sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. That is a recent addition, starting in 2016. It was implemented May 13th, which means that at Gallaudet, you cannot discriminate on the basis of colour, race, religion, national origin, nor disability, and those have been standard for many years. But the additional element from 2016 onwards is that Gallaudet recognised that discrimination had happened against sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So that has now been made, is now prohibited as well. So discrimination against those three protected groups is also codified in Gallaudet's policy. If you don't have a similar policy, I'd suggest that you look at what you do have and consider adding it as further protection for your student body. And now, as I get ready to wrap up the presentation, the heart of my message today is that knowledge is power and it promotes understanding. The more we know, the more we understand. Schools should always be a safe space for all of our students. We want students to want to come to school, and they typically do, unless they feel unsafe. And so that's the piece that we need to address. Continue providing a positive learning environment, and students will feel safe at your school. Depending on which state you're in, there are some legal expectations on protection for students in the school environment too. So look at those. If students are harmed by bullying or some of those other negative aspects I mentioned earlier, they're at risk of not being protected. So take a look at that. So it's really important to look at the laws and policies that you have in your state and your school, and look at the gender policies. If you don't have them, set them up. The goal is to protect our students. That is absolutely number one. And it can make a huge difference providing support to LGBTQ students in your environment when they want to come to school. Suicidal thoughts and ideations decrease, bullying decreases, and those negative engagements decreasing means positive reinforcement is increasing. And that's doing justice to our students in this environment. When they've got access to all of this information as growing up, it's a whole different thing for them. I didn't have access, but students now can, and they learn from each other as our kids, and they can learn from us. Thank you so much for watching, and I am looking forward to whatever questions you may have. And Blake says, I have a list of resources and links for you that are at the end of my slides. So please feel free to use those, look them up. All of those resources are available for you. Wonderful presentation, Blake. We are going to take a short break, and please stand by for this message from our advertisers, and we'll be back momentarily for the question and answer with Blake. Thank you. We will now start the question and answer component of our discussion with Blake. So I'm delighted to join Blake, delighted to invite Blake to join us.
Hello. Hope you can see me all right.
Yes, indeed. Wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Hope you all enjoyed watching my video presentation.
I did. So many things that you touched on. It's amazing. And we have a list of questions for you to get through. So the first one is, how did you get started on this journey?
Well, I think I mentioned this before. I really did not have access to the language I needed to understand who I was. So when I started this journey, it was really when I first got connected to social media. I saw people on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Tumblr, different social media platforms that showed me what the word non-binary really meant. And that was the point in my journey that I started to understand who I was. It was a feeling of something that had been missing from me that I knew was there, that I had no words to express, and I was finally glad to find it.
Terrific. Now I'm looking at audience questions here as well. What makes the classroom safe for gender expansive students?
I think the bottom line is that we support students, that we work to end discrimination against them in our lesson plans, in the photos that we show. We need to show boys, girls, and non-binary pictures to be sure that students are representative. Separating students by boys and girls in the classroom will certainly become an uneasy experience for students who don't feel like they fit in those groups. Students shouldn't have to pick the group in which they work based on their genitals. I think we need to work quite diligently to remove the concept of gender as the easy way to divide students into work groups.
Yeah, I do think it's really important that we take those labels away from students at a young age. Okay, we have 3 questions in one coming up. What can teachers do to support their students if a student expresses that they are transgender? How do you find out their identity if the students don't tell you? And if the kid is going through transition, what do you say to parents? in terms of
that's a very good question. I think the first question was, how do we give support? Really, if a student lets me know that they think that they're transgender, I want to make sure that they understand what that is, right? Students need to know what that term means. They need to understand that there are different gender identities, and many don't. So we need to either teach ourselves or do some research as to what gender identity really means. And we need to be honest with students. I think students realize that we don't know things when we try to fake it. And we need to be honest with them when we don't know the answers. We can say, I don't really know about that. I will find some resources for you. I will find some books if you'd like to read. And that's okay. That's a wonderful response. It's better than giving a response that will demean the child's identity. It's always appropriate to refer to other resources or other people. What was the second part of the question?
So if we're considering a student who hasn't necessarily identified themselves as transgender, but we suspect they are, what do we do?
Students will tell you. When they're ready to tell you, they'll tell you. But we need to provide them with the language through stories, through other examples that we provide in the classroom so that they're ready to tell you and they have the language to do it. We need to let the children be themselves and figure out how they want to express themselves, but empower them to do that. If a student feels like they may be trans or non-binary, they will come out when it's time to come out. But we need to give them the resources ahead of time so that they know how to do that.
And the third part of this question was about parents. If they're worrying that their child may want to transition, but may later regret it.
Mm-hmm. That's something that medical doctors can very easily help out with. So when it comes to medical transition, surgery is something that isn't an option until the age of 16. It depends on which state, of course, but 16 is going to be the minimum age for surgery to take place. So if that is a concern, it's really about letting the child become an adult to make their own decision when a medical transition would be viable. If we talk about a trans girl, that person can take testosterone blockers to begin with, starting at age 9 or 10, and that will delay puberty in that person. And if then later the trans girl realizes that they don't want to go with surgery or that they actually aren't trans, then that can be reversed. So it's important that you start young with reversible therapies. That's the case for a trans girl. For a trans boy, they would want to reduce the amount of estrogen that they're producing. And so the hormone replacement therapy may actually change the body's composition. So it really depends on the person's age, their identity, and the exact therapies that are offered.
All very important information. All right, let me look at these. This next question. So if a student has decided that they're a different gender than that they were assigned at birth, but they're under 18, what school services should be provided for that student? And what dorm should they stay in, assuming it's a residential program? Should they be in the boys' dorm or the girls' dorm, for example? And what sports teams do they join? And how does the school avoid discrimination? And there's actually another part to that question, but I'll hold it for now.
Okay, so that the answer to this question really depends on your school policy and your state law. The best practice would be for that student to be allowed to join the team that matches the gender they identify with. And in Washington, D.C., we do allow that to happen. The same is true with the dorm situation. The gender that the student identifies with is the placement, determines the placement of their dorm. If parents of cisgendered students are concerned about placing a transgender student in the same dorm as their child, that there may be the possibility of pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy happening, then that's something that you need to address. But I also believe that it's important to maintain confidentiality, that we should not be announcing to parents that there's a transgender child who is living in the dorm, that they were born at a sex that does not match their gender identity. So that is also a consideration that we need to keep in mind, the privacy of those students.
Great. Let me just look over the questions. We have so many wonderful questions for you. An audience member has asked, if the parents of a student don't want you having these kinds of discussion with their child, how do you approach that? And also, how do you look at parents who don't want teachers using the child's preferred pronoun?
That does happen a lot, unfortunately. Parents object to using gender identity in the classroom or the gender spectrum. They object to discussing sexual orientation. And there's really nothing that a teacher can do in those types of situations. They just need to continue to do their best work. And it's up to the parents to do some self-reflection as to why it is that they object to those topics being discussed in class. We want to maintain a positive environment in which we uplift all of our students. And if we're not teaching, then our students aren't going to learn. So we need to break the cycle of silence about these issues in our classrooms so that our students are empowered to describe themselves, to develop their own identities, and to discover who they really are. It's not a parent's place to object about my lesson plans or the things that are taught in our schools. Oftentimes, we hear these types of objections, and they may want to remove their child from our school. That's a very difficult decision to be made. But I feel like there are some opportunities to engage with parents and for them to understand why it is that we're teaching the things that we're doing.
Well, that brings something to mind, actually, then. What supports do schools have for parents whose students are transitioning or are trans?
Can you clarify that question again?
Sure. Is there any training or resources available for parents of trans students provided by the schools?
That's actually a really good question. I know that there are a lot of books. Trans kids, trans teenagers have, some resources available to them, and there are some books for parents of trans children and trans teenagers. They're certainly geared toward a mainstream audience. There's nothing in particular about deaf trans children or deaf trans teenagers. I think there have been some workshops that have been given for many years. Alex Leffern has given one. I know there are a lot more within our community. So for parents of trans children, I think there are some resources, but I don't believe that there are many.
Okay, thanks. Now, you mentioned the Kendall bathrooms. That started several questions on our list. How did the conversation begin at Kendall about the bathrooms, and how long until the approach became permanent?
We had started that in the early education environment department. And we decided that that was going to be the easiest system for our entire school to use. It was too complicated to have two different systems. So we went to the other departments, K through 2nd, 3rd through 5th, and 6th through 8th, and talked with those department teachers and said, we know that there are some non-binary students in these grades, and we want all students to feel comfortable using the restroom. So it took about a year for us to organize around this system to finalize the way it would work. And it's been going pretty well now. We don't have the budget to do the things that we would like to do, that I mentioned, which would be to renovate the bathrooms, to have floor-to-ceiling stalls. But I feel like we're very lucky as a smaller school to be able to implement a system like this that allows our students to feel safe in the restroom. In larger schools, obviously that's going to be more difficult. There are more students circulating. The bathrooms are are larger. They're maybe further apart. And so that's going to require a deeper dive into how you can implement a system like this. But I think every school should have at least 1 or 2 gender-neutral bathrooms at a minimum, so that children who feel like they don't identify with the gender binary can feel comfortable using at least 1 bathroom on campus.
Great ideas, thank you. So now when we look at the idea of early childhood, a common assessment is to ask children to identify a picture of a boy and a girl for a comprehension check. But how do we do that while respecting that the child might not identify with that appearance, particularly when a young child may not have a choice?
That's a great question. I am a school psychologist myself, so I give assessments all the time, and that's something that I struggle with on my own accord. I hope that in the future, in the very near future, the American Psychological Association or the National Association of School Psychologists will start to reframe the assessments and look at the necessity of having this gender binary in the assessments. I believe it would be possible to throw out those types of questions and still get at the same type of assessment. Of course, that will require restandardization, which is a big negative. But I've actually had a couple of students, when I've asked that question, they've said, well, I don't really know, because it's hard to identify gender just based on a picture. So I give them points for that, because I think that's a great answer.
Indeed. Now, the next question asks about legally changing your name from your dead name, and which states allow X on the driver's license as a sex marker.
So I've legally changed my name. I went through the court system in California for my driver's license. I haven't done it for my birth certificate. I would have to go to Vital Records Court, and that process is much lengthier than the process I went through for my driver's license. I've changed that on my driver's license, on my bank accounts, on my Social Security card, and other places to Blake. So that's a legal name change. There are a number of states that allow X. I believe California, Utah, Nevada, Oregon, Arkansas allows it, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Colorado, Minnesota, Massachusetts allow X on a driver's license. And my driver's license indeed carries the sex of X.
And do you think the other states are going to take up that policy fairly soon? Is it going to become nationwide?
I hope so too. Oh, and one of our audience members says Washington State allows it as well. So thanks for that comment.
Terrific. So what does non-binary mean?
The term non-binary means that somebody does not identify with the gender binary, which is the idea that there are only 2 buckets, male and female. So a non-binary person can identify with both, or they might not identify with either. It just means that in some way, they don't feel like the traditional 2-bucket system works for them.
And could you clarify the sign for cisgender for us? Is it the same as the sign for soul?
Yeah, a lot of people say that it looks like the sign for soul. Yeah.
Am I doing it right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. It really, of course, depends on the context that you're using it, right? If you're talking about gender, then you're going to use the sign and somebody knows that it means cis. If you're talking about religion, for example, you might mean soul.
So there's a lot of questions around the signs for non-gender terminology. Perhaps you wouldn't mind going over those again?
Yeah, so here was lesbian. And then gay, we fingerspell, G-A-Y. For bisexual, we tend to just sign B-I for bi rather than the whole the whole name bisexual. Transgender, here's intersex. Asexual is typically just fingerspelled. Yeah, so I think that was the entire acronym.
Terrific, thanks. And then as a related question, what's the best pronoun for a non-binary person?
Every non-binary person is going to be different. So the best way to find somebody's pronouns is to ask. The safest thing to do is to use the they pronoun, but it's always a polite thing to ask somebody what their pronouns are if you'd like.
I do agree, asking might be a good choice. Now, from an interpreter's perspective, should an interpreter ask the client with whom they're about to work what that client's preferred pronoun is before starting a job?
I would recommend that interpreters do that. I always appreciate when an interpreter asks what my preferred pronouns are. It recognizes that I have pronouns that I prefer, and it will avoid misgendering me in the interpretation.
Yeah, I agree. It's important to clarify that. Is the term gender neutral the same as gender inclusive?
No, it isn't. Gender neutral, gender neutral is like an avoidance of gender, right? It's to say that, as in the example of a bathroom, that there is no gender assigned to that bathroom. It includes all genders. Gender inclusive says that we recognize any gender, all the genders in the spectrum. Gender neutral says it doesn't, that there is no gender assigned in this space. So the concepts are slightly different. They may overlap and have some similarities, but they are exclusive of each other.
So which word is preferable where bathrooms are concerned?
I like gender inclusive as a term. If I see a sign that says gender inclusive bathroom, I love it. As a non-binary person, as trans men and trans women, I hear so many people say that they love seeing the term gender inclusive because it feels like they're being recognized more than gender neutral.
I can certainly see how that would reflect feeling recognized. Okay, the next question is a long one. How do we approach a person with a different identity in the community to use the right pronoun? I think this relates to deaf culture. So when we describe a person and we say that they are the tall person who's male with small teeth, how do we do that in a non-binary way? Do we identify them as lesbian? Do we say they, them? How does all of that work?
Yeah, I agree. That's a good question, because it is true that in deaf culture, we use a lot of descriptors. I think we can talk about someone's appearance in a gender neutral way, right? That they have glasses, that they have short hair, that they're wearing a certain kind of t-shirt, and avoid using gender labels. You may say that that somebody looks masculine. You may say that that person has a beard, rather than say that person is a man or that person must be male. So if we can avoid using an assumption of gender, but still describe somebody's looks, I think that that's totally appropriate.
So we could say the person with curly red hair and the purple shirt, for example. Yeah, I get that. Okay, is it okay to ask a trans person about surgery if you're looking for opinions and advice to help learn more about the process and resources? Are those kinds of questions okay?
Yes, of course. There's a big difference between a curiosity as to somebody's surgical status or medical situation versus asking about trans issues. If somebody asks me about my surgical history, I tend to be pretty open with that. But there are a lot of trans people who don't want to talk about that. That's a trigger for them. And it's not appropriate to assume that every trans person wants to talk about their body morphology. It is, however, important that we understand what that situation is generally for trans people so that we're aware of it. So I think it's important for you to try to understand your own motivations. If you're simply trying to find out about your colleague's history, that might not be an appropriate question to ask. If you want to know generally about trans surgeries, there are certainly a lot of resources on Google, on YouTube, or you can ask in a more general way of your trans friends.
So perhaps the pronoun question is relevant, but the rest of them may just be idle curiosity. Okay, what about questions around when the best time is for transition?
Ideally, it would be just before puberty, to be honest. And that, of course, requires the child to have the language and the courage to identify as trans. That their inside doesn't quite match their outside. And so if they can do that by the time puberty rolls around, then that is the ideal time frame. For me, that didn't happen. I was late into my teenage years and to young adulthood by the time that happened. And some people are even later. Some children are able to identify that even earlier. There's really no wrong time. There are different, as we mentioned, different stages, different types of transition, social, legal, medical. I don't want to say that there's a perfect time because there's always the right time for everyone.
And what do you think the work is for, as you as a school psychologist? How do you think this impacts you? I guess it's a hard question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason that we need to talk about this is because if you don't want to go through puberty twice. And as I mentioned, going on to an HRT regime is like going through puberty. And if you do that once as a young teenager, and then you have to do it again, that's a really difficult experience for somebody. So it's important we talk about this early.
I can imagine. So now looking to research studies, what's the best practice to combine deaf LGBTQIA respondents in one sample or to separate them into different subgroups, like gender identity and sexual orientation, for example? And I ask this because a transgender individual might perhaps self-identify as female for gender and as heterosexual for sexual orientation. So what do you think the divisions should best be for research studies?
I think it probably depends on what the research is about. If the research is about sexual orientation in trans people in the deaf community, then great, lump them together. If it's only about sexual orientation, then I would say you wouldn't want to focus so much on gender identity. As one example, you could take a trans woman who identifies as straight and maybe do some research on gay, lesbian, and bisexuality among trans women. And in that case, you would want to have different variables of sexual orientation and gender identity. If, however, you're only looking at research about sexual orientation, then gender identity might not be as important a variable in those types of studies.
That certainly makes sense. Let's turn to K through 12 settings. What kind of resources or curriculum should we be sharing around transgender issues or LGBTQIA in general? Like, what should we be talking about? Is it, what stories should we look at? Are they stories about famous people? Are we looking at those members of the community we've lost to murder? What should we be talking about?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, our curriculum should be one that we choose because it is inclusive of everyone. We should be talking about the history of racism, and we should also be talking about the history of discrimination against other people. If our curriculum doesn't talk about LGBTQIA people, then we're marginalizing those students in our classrooms. Just like when you pick a deaf studies curriculum, we want to make sure that it's as inclusive of the deaf community. So I'm not a teacher, I'm a school psychologist, and so I'm not an expert on picking a curriculum, but I do think that it's important that teachers do their research when they choose curricula in their classrooms and make sure that they pick one that is inclusive of all students.
I so agree. Yeah, and this idea of a safe space and a safe environment is just all very much tied up in that. Okay, for preschool teachers of deaf students, how do you recommend they go about introducing the idea of gender to young children who may have very little language due to language deprivation?
That's certainly tough. I think it's important that we start with visuals for those students, show pictures of the diversity of gender representation. You can show a baby boy transitioning to a girl and try to explain why that's happened, because that person's gender identity did not match their sex assigned at birth. And depending on how old the child is, say if they're at the age of 5 and they've been language deprived, we can use other resources to scaffold their learning, especially language resources as they continue to develop their language knowledge. But pictures, especially visual representations of the gender spectrum, are going to be really important for all deaf children, especially those who don't have full access to language. And we can use them to reinforce language acquisition.
I've just been told we only have 10 minutes left. Okay, here comes a really good question. So for students from low income or religious backgrounds where they're perhaps less welcoming to the LGBT community, and they may be at risk when they leave the deaf school and go home for the weekends, what can we do to help those students learn to cope at their home environment with their families and in a place where their gender identity puts their safety at risk?
That is always an incredibly difficult thing. What I always emphasize in the school is that we have support resources for them at school because we know that they're not going to get them at home. When students come to school, they want to be motivated to learn. They want to be motivated to have friends, to have role models, to have the supports they need, to be counseled on how life is going to go. And so that's a big challenge for us. That's a big thing that we need to provide them if they're not going to be getting that at home. And it is unfortunate that many students, when they go home, have to hide their identities because their family life doesn't support it. This is a place where allies are going to be important. We know that is true as deaf people, having hearing allies, but in the LGBTQIA community, we need allies to create safe spaces for us to be who we are. And if that isn't true at that child's home, then they'll probably need to have additional resources given to them, for example, school counseling in the school setting.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine a 14-year-old student feeling unsafe about going home.
Yeah, and it depends on why they feel unsafe. If this is really a situation of abuse, then we'll need to report this to the proper authorities. If it's simply a feeling of discomfort, that they just don't feel like they fit in at home, then we need to make sure in the school environment that they're being provided those additional resources so that they're able to learn and feel comfortable at the same time.
Yeah, I do agree. Do you think it's an end goal that we discontinue traditional pronouns and identities? I mean, would it be easier if we just used one another's names and used all neutral pronouns rather than gendering pronouns? How would we do that? It seems like it would make it easier.
I wouldn't say that there's an end goal. I think we're always trying to make progress. And I think it is nice to be recognized as somebody who has gender, no matter what it is. I've seen some great progress in people introducing themselves and providing their pronouns. For me, I do forget sometimes. I try to do my best to always introduce myself with my pronouns. And I try to emphasize that I am a non-binary person, because I do often get misgendered as a man. People use he, him pronouns for me, and that's frustrating. So when I introduce myself, I have to remind myself to give my pronouns so that I'm not causing other people to trigger me. And I wouldn't call that an end goal, but I do think the goal of making progress is set in motion through that. And as long as we're all on the same page to use pronouns in our email signatures, to respect each other for those pronouns, we're going to avoid the type of hurt that has come from misgendering.
I am seeing people including their pronouns more often in email signatures. So I think you're right that it's work in progress. A last question is, are there any national or state registries of deaf psychologists or psychiatrists to whom we can refer students? It's already hard enough to find counsellors who sign for our deaf students, but perhaps now that we're in a virtual world, actually connecting to people regardless of geography might be easier. What do you think?
I'm not exactly sure about therapists for under 18s. We do have the National Deaf Therapists Alliance, and they do provide telehealth services. There is also a deaf counseling center online that provides services, and those are the two that I know of. Both serve the general population nationwide. Potentially, there are some states in which they cannot provide services, but you'll need to look into those two organizations. In the states, there are certain states where there will be a higher chance of finding a deaf-friendly or a deaf therapist, and some states where there will be a lower chance. So check out those two organizations and see what they offer.
Yeah, I do think that the field of deaf therapists and counsellors is growing though, so that's positive.
Oh, and I'll add, for students under the age of 18, they obviously have access to their school counselors in the school who can provide therapy and from time to time. Psychologists in school settings generally don't do that, but ask for your own school's resources.
That brings us to our last question, which is, do you have any final words of wisdom that you'd like to impart to our audience members as they get ready to conclude this session?
Yeah, I think, people just need to remember that this topic is not something that we can cover in 2 hours. It's going to be something that needs to stay on our minds continuously. And I need to do that work for myself too. The sense of shame or embarrassment about this topic is something that we need to shed, because we have students in our classrooms who don't know that it's okay to feel the way that they feel, and that that's a normal human emotion. So it's up to us to get the training, to go to workshops that we need to make ourselves better, to provide better resources in our schools so that our students feel safe and protected. And that's really the mission of schools, is to serve our students and to help them grow into the individuals that they'd like to grow into.
Blake, it has been such a pleasure to have you join us today. And I hope that this topic gives people much more room for thought in terms of gender inclusiveness and how we can work toward making our students feel safe. So we have a teachers panel at 4 o'clock this afternoon, which should be also amazing. And at this point, we'd like to thank the interpreters who've been working and this environment that we've done because of COVID-19. Those teachers are going to be talking about some of the changes they've made. So thank you to the support services personnel for today's session. And Blake, thank you so much for your presence today.
Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the day.
A final word from our sponsors.